Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the first in the Notre Dame London Global Gateway Sustainable Future Lecture Series. Each year, the University of Notre Dame selects a theme on which to focus. The forum theme this year is Care for Our Common Home, Just Transition to a Sustainable Future. The Notre Dame Forum is intended to mobilize the entire university community globally around questions of environmental justice and sustainability. Today's lecture, Why Does Biodiversity Matter to Us All?, is the first of the 3 lectures in our Sustainable Future lecture series. Today, our speaker will look at how the issue of climate change has sunk into the public and religious consciousness, even if controversial in some quarters, and even as many don't really understand why we need to care about biodiversity from a religious and moral perspective. But before I welcome our speaker, I want to thank all of the co-sponsors of this event: the Office of Notre Dame National, the Office of Sustainability at Notre Dame, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, ThinkND, and Durham's Center for Catholic Studies. Each of our partners has helped us to bring this together and to share it throughout their networks so that we can continue to promote these timely and innovative programs. We ask that if you have questions for Celia, please use the Google form that we are sharing with you in the chat feature now. We'll address them after the lecture, but please submit them whenever they occur to you throughout the lecture, and we'll have them as we conclude. Our distinguished speaker today is Celia Deane-Drummond, who comes to us uniquely qualified to address the topic of today's lecture, having begun her academic career in the natural sciences, focusing on plant physiology and agricultural botany. The global and ethical challenges of the use of genetically modified organisms encouraged her to retrain in theology, education, and environmental ethics. Celia now serves as the director of the Laudato Si Institute of Campion Hall at Oxford University. She leads the multidisciplinary research work of the Institute, develops and fosters its collaborative partnerships and projects, including those with the church and other allied organizations, such as the University of Notre Dame. We're honored to welcome her today in the first of our lecture series. I turn it over to you, Celia, and welcome.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and it's a real joy and pleasure to be with you this evening. I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. So you should see some slides for this lecture now. So I think that care for our common home, just transition to a sustainable future, is one of the most crucially important things that our society has had to face. And I hope to convince you by the end of this talk that care for our common home matters to us all. And it's making this a priority which will enable that transition to a sustainable future. We're currently living in the aftermath of one of the most significant conference of parties on climate change that was held on our doorstep here in Glasgow in Scotland. And the official discussions focused on shifting to a net zero carbon economy and the agonizing political decisions necessary to get there. But the unofficial COP, populated by civil society movements, was, I would say, even more vibrant. They recognized that in order to shift cultures towards widespread change, there has to be a change of heart and mind, not just focusing on technological solutions. And perhaps more than the COP26 meeting, they acknowledged that the whole Earth system and the people and creatures living in it were under serious threat because of our abuse of our relationship with the natural world. Scientific analysis tells us that different stable boundaries are now being breached in this system, particularly biodiversity loss and, of course, climate change. And you'll notice on this slide that loss of biodiversity in the genetic area is in the bright red zone. So it reached a kind of emergency proportions even before that of climate change. And the upcoming UN Convention on Biological Diversity in April next year is crucially important to consider, not least because biodiversity loss and climate change are closely interconnected, as I hope to show you today. The HE biodiversity targets set in 2010, while it had widespread global support, haven't yet been realized, rather like the COP15 Paris Climate Change Agreement targets. But just to run through these HE targets with you very briefly, one was address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity across government and society. Second, reducing direct pressures on biodiversity loss and promoting sustainable use. Thirdly, improve biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystem species and genetic diversity. Enhance the benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services. Notice that language of services, fairly instrumental, as I will explain a bit later. Understanding the value of biodiversity from an ethical and theological point of view takes us a little bit further and gives us more energy, if you like, around change. And then the final one was implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. None of those have really been met. So the question then is, will the next one do any better? And this one is promising more. It was originally meant to meet in 2020, but it's now meeting in 2022 and coming in China, 2 years late because of COVID-19. And I would say that we're living in this year in a watershed time. I think it's as much significance as in 2015 when Pope Francis first released that amazing encyclical Laudato Si. Theologians will speak of this time as a kairos moment. Pope Francis realized then in 2015, just as we do now, that unless we take immediate international action to mitigate greenhouse gases and sequester carbon dioxide, global warming will continue to rise, making life on Earth, including human life, impossible, both for people and for other creatures occupying very large parts of our planet. Not all have the luxury to flee. Refugees, human and creaturely, are in a desperate state, as we found out from the news broadcast this week of people who have drowned in the Channel trying to escape from refugees trying to escape oppression. But environmental refugees or refugees fleeing because they know their home no longer exists because of rising floods and so on, and sea level rises are going to be in an even worse situation. Geologist Krista Skoste observes that the problem we face is not so much where we are headed, but how we will get there. And that's because instead of gradually warming up, as has happened historically in the past in climate shifts, the Earth is now really rapidly heating up. And the biosphere, including us, simply doesn't have the time to adapt to these new conditions. And climate change has been one of the very main drivers behind 5 mass extinction events over the last 541 million years. In one of these, 90% of all organisms were killed, and life on Earth almost came to a finish. Anthropocentric climate change, which we're currently living through, could lead to an equally catastrophic loss. Increases in storms, floods, droughts, loss of homes and livelihoods, and an irreversible loss of species should act to us like a wake-up call for a humanity that, as Pope Francis puts it in Laudato Si, seems to have become indifferent to suffering. So what about the ecological realities facing us? We're driving species to extinction at about 100 to 1,000 times the background rate. That is, the degree of loss independent of human activity, that is the background. And this has come to be known by many biologists and others as the 6th great mass extinction event. The difference this time is that it has been caused by one of us, that one of its actors, that is us. Humanity, and especially those on the margins, but increasingly everyone as well, including those in the richer nations of the world, is suffering the bitter consequences of eroding biodiversity. Literally millions of people are losing their livelihoods. Poverty is growing, food and water are becoming increasingly scarce. Climate change is accelerating, the weather is far less predictable. Extreme and out of the ordinary heat waves and floods are now becoming commonplace. And the background to this slide is just one flood that happened in Oxford in the last year or so. And as Pope Francis recognized some 6 years ago, it's the poorest of the poor who are bearing the brunt of this socio-ecological crisis. When considering what else we are losing forever, it's useful to think about the different elements of biodiversity. Genetic diversity is about the genetic variation of life between individuals of a population and between populations. Organismal diversity, on the other hand, refers to differences between individuals and between populations that make up subspecies and species, enlarging outwards to include genera, families, and phyla. While in variations in habitats, ecosystems, and so on, make up what's called by biologists ecological diversity. And you'll notice that populations are important and common to all three kinds of diversity. And the Living Planet Index tracks, or LPI, tracks global average temperatures in populations of vertebrate species across different habitats. And it's a kind of index or measure, if you will, of the overall state of biodiversity loss. And you'll notice that between 1970 and 2016, it's shown a 68% loss. That's in my lifetime and maybe some of yours. Only 4 years earlier, in 2012, it stood at 58%. And that again illustrates the extremely rapid acceleration in losses, most likely caused by a common combination of habitat destruction, invasive species, and also climate change all working together. And one of the interesting things about this Living Planet Index is that it is measuring vertebrate species, but we have to remember too that invertebrates comprise a far greater proportion of the biosphere in both species number and biomass than these vertebrates reported in the LPI. And they're important for the food chain, providing energy for a great variety of vertebrates, including birds, reptiles, amphibia, and fish. And insects play a vital role as pollinators in plants and agriculture. Over the last 50 years, their diversity has declined continuously. In some parts of the world, it's now dramatically low levels. About 40% of all insects may become extinct in the next couple of decades. In one protected area in Germany, for example, the average biomass of airborne insects has been reduced by up to 76%, and maybe even up to 82% in just 27 years. And that story can be repeated in multiple other places as well. Forests and their rich biological diversity are particularly susceptible to these kinds of external pressures, and tropical forests have suffered the most, with the Amazonian rainforest being a really tragic case in point. By June 2020, deforestation in Brazil alone had reached more than 11,000 square kilometers annually, which is an area the size of Jamaica. The Living Planet Index shows geographical variation in reasons for population. The Living Planet report shows geographical variation in reasons for population and species losses. And in all major geographic regions, the main driver does seem to be change in land use for residential, agriculture, and commercial reasons at the moment. So while environmental pollution and climate change also contribute to that biodiversity loss, land use change and invasive species are just at the moment more important. But as climate change becomes more extreme, it may become the main factor in biodiversity loss. But the point is that all these factors intersect. Agricultural land use, for example, destroys the ability of the living soil to absorb carbon, and that then increases climate change. The two are in a positive feedback loop. The ecological footprint of the human community is also far too big to be contained by the biocapacity of the earth. As many are aware, it'll take 1.6 Earths to sustain our unsustainable lifestyle. The disproportionate use of ecological resources by a fraction of that population isn't under dispute in any of the calculations done by different groups and scientists. The serious threat to biodiversity as well is not simply what happens to other creatures. Aside from food and shelter, humans depend heavily on ecosystems to provide them with, including other necessities, energy, climate regulation, purification of air and water, flood protection, medicine, as well as cultural, recreational, aesthetic, and spiritual services, as you could call them. And when ecosystem health is compromised due to the extensive loss of biodiversity, all life, including human life, is at risk of losing the very foundation of survival. And I'm going to illustrate this point a little bit clearer by referring to a marine biologist who I had the good fortune to come across a few years ago, and who's now a leading voice at the National Geographic programme, who argued in a lecture delivered for the Laudato Si Research Institute that the origin of COVID was also directly related to our disruption of natural systems. This is what he says, quote, "As we venture deeper and deeper into what was once wild, we not only disrupt ecosystems, but also come into contact with stressed animals shedding viruses. Farms intrude upon forests, and loggers and miners push into pristine ecosystems. That increases our chances of being exposed to new diseases for which we have no immunity. Today, 96% of the massive mammals on our planet are humanity and our domesticated livestock taken together. Only 4% is everything else, from elephants to tigers to panda bears. 70% of all birds are now domesticated poultry, mostly chickens. And 90% of the large fish in the ocean have been extracted by fishing. Yet only 7% of the ocean is now designated or planned as protected, and that means ecosystems across the world are under threat. But also, he elaborates in a fascinating way how the forest itself generates its own healthy ecosystem. This is what he says, quote, "The Congo Basin forest in West Africa, one of the richest and most valuable ecosystems on the planet. One reason the Congo Basin system is so rich is that it gets heavy rain. And here's something fascinating about that rain. The forest creates it. So the consequences of cutting down the forests is that it will literally dry up water supplies for millions of people." And here's another quote. "If we cut down that forest, the cycle will break. The rain will no longer fall in such abundance. That means no more water or food in Ethiopia. That's 125 million people now, probably double that by 2050. And the Ethiopian highlands provide water for most of the Nile. Enter Sudan and Egypt with an additional 138 million people and growing." So the point in this example makes really clear what Pope Francis indicated in Laudato Si, that the earth and its peoples are deeply interconnected. If we destroy the earth and its creatures, it is people who will suffer. So it's not just a matter of paying attention either to conservation or poverty. The two are bound up together with one another. Healthy forests and ecosystems also harbour less disease and shed less viruses, as Enric Sala has said. More importantly, he goes on to say this, quote, "A healthy natural world is our best vaccine, but our broken relationship with nature is costing the world too much unnecessary loss of human life, plus trillions of dollars in economic losses," end of quote. And this language of broken relationship is it seems to me, an implicit theology. It's as if scientists are naming what theologians have really failed adequately to do, and that's recognize that our broken relationship with the natural world amounts to a serious, and I would say indeed a mortal sin, for it takes us away from the creator of life. Further, wild places are like our life support system. They generate the air we breathe, they produce the food we need, they clean the water we drink. They're capable of absorbing half the carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere. It seems obvious we need to care for creation, and yet we're still, it seems, reluctant to do it. If the facts about our living interconnected planet have failed to convince, maybe we need to understand once more the foundations for the way we think about our humanity and our relationship with other and with God. Theology, though, and religion are not necessarily innocent either. If we portray heaven as otherworldly and portray God as one who's remote from our human condition, our religious beliefs refuse to face the ecological realities facing us and our own human responsibilities within that. We need rather an integral approach, as Pope Francis has argued, so that rather than treating ecology as a separate discipline, it needs to be integrated into our social and economic institutions and frameworks. We need to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor together rather than separately. Integral ecology is not just about a different way of approaching ecology that combines it with the social issues, but it's a fundamentally different paradigm or way of thinking about the world, grounded in theological beliefs, which offer a stark alternative to the technological paradigm that Pope Francis suggests is responsible for the damage we're continuing to cause. So behind the devastation of our planetary home is the human will bent on domination through a technological mindset that's lost the ability to find connectivity with each other and our natural world. And as ecologists the world over recognize, human beings are integrated into the ecological system and not separated from it. Laudato Si abounds with references to integral ecology as that openness to our God-given place in creation, which we need to overcome that crisis that we're in and restore our relationship with creation. Where the technological paradigm seems to have as its core the desire for maximization of individual power and wealth, often coming through technological means, the integral ecology paradigm revolves around solidarity, care, and responsibility for all. So if there's one message to take home from Laudato Si, is that it's humanity that needs to transition from the technocratic to the integral ecology paradigm. Pope Francis's understanding of integral ecology also includes a sense of transcendence that goes further than either mathematical or scientific formulations. And this awareness is at the heart of our human identity. He doesn't, by the way, resist the discoveries of science. He just argues that the technology shouldn't become our other paradigm that, if you like, replaces this other way of looking at the world. So what is required then is that new way, and some might even say a second enlightenment that leads forth to that different way of perceiving who we are in the world and our role in it. Protecting the earth system and its creatures is another way of saying we're protecting ourselves. And we're honoring the God who is the creator of all and who dwells in and with all creatures on earth through divine immanence. So what about ecological conversion then, that Pope Francis speaks about in some detail? Conversion always involves a fundamental decision, even if it's not always available to analytical reflection. In this sense, radical ecological conversion is the return to our God-intended way of being in the world, and a reorientation of our concerns from self-centered obsession with wealth or consumerism, control and power, into that genuine care for the well-being of all creatures, purely for the sake of their intrinsic value, goodness, and participation in God's creation. So he's going further than the HE targets that just talked about biodiversity in an instrumental kind of way. And like all virtues, this care for the other must be honed until we assume a new habit of concern and action. And as Pope Francis put it so elegantly, turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering. Individuals can very easily feel overwhelmed by the daunting task that lies ahead. But Laudato Si assures us that even in the smallest of deeds, in humble, loving daily gestures, the converted can help convert the system. Strength can be found then in a lived spirituality, but also the realization that we're utterly dependent on one another and cannot hope for change by removing ourselves from society, or for that matter, by trying to take on the world's problems by ourselves. So even seemingly superfluous acts of love and kindness, of mutual care, are civic and political, and so help us move society closer to an integral ecology. Educational establishments that are formed in Christian and Catholic traditions can begin then to shift towards a holistic and radical conversion, and so begin to live out the gospel and not just preach it. As Pope Francis indicates, a dialogical mode of proceeding is essential. To quote Laudato Si, true wisdom as the fruit of self-examination, dialogue, and generous encounter between persons is not acquired by a mere accumulation of data, which eventually leads to overload and confusion, a sort of mental pollution. So that, quote again, no branch of wisdom can be left out, including that arising from cultures other than our own. And he names particularly here that arising from indigenous communities. The earth and its creatures in it then cannot wait. So what we need now is not just more information, but wisdom. When we come to think about what kind of development that we need to have in our societies and in our communities, then developing ecological virtues are, I suggest, the tools through which we can begin to practice ecological conversion. Practical wisdom or prudence is concerned with deliberation, judgment, and action. So it cannot be separated from practical ethics. Socially important virtues, such as justice, are judged as approaching true virtue, but only when they align with practical wisdom. And that's why practical wisdom is so important, because it tells us what justice needs to look like in the context of climate change and other harms that we face. Let's give a concrete example. So there's a situation of a conflict of interest between acting so as to reduce one's carbon footprint, such as using a form of transport relying on battery power, and the mining of lithium used for those batteries, which then has negative consequences on vulnerable poor communities in the global south. How do we know what to do? Well, I suggest the exercise of practical wisdom helps to sort out what the right course of action needs to be. It may be that right action is to press for structural change in mining practices so that those communities don't suffer further exploitation, even if the price of lithium goes up as a result. Practical wisdom then is a virtue or habit of mind orientated towards excellence. However, it's not just about the good for the individual, but it's a common good, or the community of the whole, including those living in the global south, and I suggest the community of all creatures. Working out what that is isn't necessarily straightforward, but it will be about discernment based on what the community considers the good is. So inasmuch as wisdom also connects very disparate and different religious traditions, it can be fruitful as a basis for discussion, leading to a global religious ethic of sustainability. In addition to prudence, the virtues of compassion and its associated virtue, mercy, also help us to connect with the needs of the poorest of the poor and the creatures who are suffering on planet Earth. And that theme of mercy has been central to Pope Francis's pontificate, but it recalls earlier papal teaching, including Pope John Paul quote John 23rd's opening speech at the Second Vatican Council, where he called for the church to engage in what he called the medicine of mercy. But I'm going to quote now Pope John Paul II, who says this: the word concept of mercy seems to cause uneasiness in man who, thanks to the enormous development of science and technology, never before known in history, has become the master of the earth and subdued and dominated it. This dominion over the earth, sometimes understood in a one-sided and superficial way, seems to leave no room for mercy. So behind this discussion is an important principle, a principle of mercy. As John Sobrino, the liberation theologian, suggests, everything, absolutely everything, turns on the exercise of mercy. He uses the term misericordia, sometimes translated as compassion. And as Thomas Aquinas recognized, the mercy of God, unlike expressions of human mercy, can never contravene justice because God is not bound by a higher law in the way that human societies are. So John Sobrino fills out Aquinas' account of what mercy entails by insisting on human imitation of Jesus's radical acts of mercy, which are orientated towards those who are most vulnerable. And so in an important way, he explores the material, social, and structural dimensions of what this mercy might look like. But in his case, he confines his attention to structural flaws in society that impact the lives of impoverished human communities. He doesn't yet expand his ideas on structural and social change to include the vulnerable and suffering creatures of the earth, which, in the light of what I've argued earlier, seems to me is absolutely vital to consider. Now we know the more about the ecological realities facing our planetary home. In an educational context then, what does practical wisdom mean? And I think it means discerning together what needs to be done. It also means making the correct decisions in the face of the unexpected. Given the number of emergencies that are constantly surfacing as climate change begins to escalate and become more extreme, and biodiversity loss deepens yet further, the ability to make good decisions is absolutely crucial. Practical wisdom also combines caution and foresight. Caution is aware of where mistakes have been made in the past and being able to adjust future policy in the light of those mistakes. Can foresight enable churches to see into the future with respect to what different strategies might entail and how each might be implemented? Practical wisdom then is orientated towards the common good, but that common good, as I've mentioned earlier, is not just good for what's good for humanity, but it's what's good for all creatures and not just us. So if different universities, colleges, and churches all start to develop sustainable strategies and practices in their local contexts, then they need also to be a place where there's a strong sense of being at home, engendering connectivity with the past. Does sustainability as practiced in the church and in our communities take sufficient account of this need for memory, which is another vital aspect of practical prudential reasoning? There's often a lack of appreciation and visions of a sustainable future as to whether justice has been done to the past, for the focus is on the needs for future generations or that of more immediate ecological communities. And I don't think we can afford to miss out on that memory. Finally, to conclude, the ecological realities we face are extreme, but we need to have the courage to face what those are without looking away in anxiety or despair. At the same time, it's possible to make a difference through the choices we make and the decisions we come to, both as individuals and as communities. Time is running out, but right actions now can protect the health of the planet and ourselves. As we start to lurch forward into a post-COVID world, we have to learn to transform our universities into places where seeds of ecological conversion can be sown and bear fruit. Even a mustard seed can grow into a tree where birds can make their nests, as Jesus reminds us in the Gospels. The message of Laudato Si was not just for a decade, but for a whole generation. And it's our generation that has the responsibility to act differently, to act according to an integral ecology paradigm, in tune with practical wisdom, to live out our lives in compassion and mercy, and to learn to slow down and turn away from the technological paradigm that threatens to engulf our world and its creatures. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Celia, for your thought-provoking and challenging words, and for the charge that is ours, especially those of us in university communities, to educate mightily around this topic. This time, I want to invite each of our participants to take a moment to fill out the form that you see in the chat function. If you have a question or a comment, please offer it there and we'll take them up. In the meantime, I'll start with some questions that were submitted earlier. Celia, I appreciate that your early training was in the sciences and that it would have made you keenly aware of the human person's impact on the planet and climate change. What inspired your move to approach it from a theological and ethical perspective that you now so champion?
Yes, I mean, it sort of goes back to a sort of biographical aspect, I think, because what happened was I was working in the next door lab. They were developing genetically modified crops, and I became increasingly concerned about some of the ethics around these. Much of the funding for those developments came from multinational companies, and it seemed I was worried on two counts. First of all, it seemed like the discipline of botany, which I was in then, and plant physiology, well, not plant physiology, but botany more generally, was being taken over by multinational companies to be used for their own gain. So genetically modified soya bean, for example, which is resistant to herbicides, and then the herbicide and that GM soya were sold together, and so the benefit was really entirely to that company rather than anything more. And secondly, some of the ethical issues about whether these should be released into the environment weren't being discussed at all. And then thirdly, I was in Manchester with Martin Palmer, who actually started the Alliance of Conservation and Ecology. And so I started getting interested in some of these areas around activism. And in order to support me through my theological work, he invited me to develop, supported again by the Worldwide Fund for Nature, a book on theology and ecology. So it was a combination of both my own sense as a scientist that things weren't being thought through sufficiently well in terms of the common good. Also, this, as I said, the multinational companies seem to be taking over in a way which I didn't think was necessarily very positive or helpful. And third, that also, I had the opportunity to meet those who were involved in various eco-activism and joining up Christianity and other religious traditions to areas around conservation. And in addition to that, many of the people I saw who were concerned about these ethical issues in the sciences were either on the verge of retirement or they were elderly professors that I didn't feel at the time that it was possible. Things have changed a bit since then, as a working scientist, to get involved in these things. So that's one of the reasons why I changed. And in a sense, that going into the area of environmental ethics and ecology, right, as I've done for the last 30 years, many people who are theologians at the time wondered whether this was just a passing phase and that it would soon fade away. But actually, instead of doing that, it's just got even more acute. So, those early sort of intuitions that I had of being concerned about some of these questions, they seem to have got worse rather than better, unfortunately, although the ethical discussions are now more widely discussed among scientists in a way that they weren't then, including areas of medical ethics and bioethics in that realm as well. So I think ethics is now less a marginal subject among scientists, but at the same time, there's still, you know, an awful lot that needs to be done.
Indeed, indeed. Celia, one of the magnificent pieces of Laudato Si was Pope Francis's attention to how climate change ultimately affects most of the poor and the vulnerable, those who are least able to attend to it, either, well, for any number of reasons, typically because it's the edges of the planet that are losing sway. How do you see how do you see others attending to the education around that? I mean, you're speaking of compassion, and misericorde is powerful, and yet it doesn't seem to come up anywhere other than in our theological reflections on the importance of it in Laudato Si. I don't know how much it played out at COP26, but I'm just curious how much. Certainly, those countries that are ill affected have made their plights known, but I'm just curious how you see us attending more specifically to these things.
Yes, I think what you're saying is, are some of these theological ideas getting into the public domain and public sphere?
Yes.
And I would say that to an extent, I think they are, but it's come through these civil society actors that, and which is why I drew up this contrast between the official meetings where this wasn't really discussed and say but the unofficial meetings, there was a lot of energy around there and around the link with religious beliefs and so on. In addition to that, at the Laudato Si Research Institute, which I direct, one of our key sort of policies is to make sure that we bring those who are in more marginalized groups to the table. And so we've set up these sort of dialogues and then start feeding into policy and practice that way. So trying to bring together at the same table those who are writing policy, but also those who might otherwise not be listened to. So I think that, you know, the church and those involved in education have this mediating role, although we also want to be academically credible. We also want to have an influence in helping societies shift in a positive direction. And I think there is beginning to be more of an openness now through sort of policy and practice to listen to some of these voices in a way that and even within the COP26 official documents, marginalized groups, indigenous communities, etc., were mentioned, but it seemed very rhetorical. There didn't seem to be much substance to what that then looked like in practice in terms of changing things. So the desire seems to be there, but then there's a missing link. And I think that theologians and others working in this area can potentially provide that missing link to enable some of the ideas surfacing to get into different kinds of practice. But it's a very long and slow process. So the temptation, for example, just to think that it's all about carbon, for example, and nothing else is strong, whereas an integral ecology approach is much more complex, but it's also much more effective in the long run.
A number of our questions are wondering if there are other major global religions that are attending in a similar way to climate change in the same way that the Catholic Church is attempting to.
Yes, I mean the Muslim community, the Islamic community has for some time stressed the importance of stewardship. We actually have a small project in our own institute where an Islamic scholar is translating some of the ideas of Laudato Si into a form which makes sense to those who are invested in the Quran, for example. So finding common threads and themes. So I think it gives a good opportunity for dialogue with other religious traditions. In the Buddhist theme of compassion for creatures, that's obviously very strong as well. So, and wisdom is too also Confucian. So there are a number of different opportunities for multi-religious dialogue across this field. I've tended to concentrate on the Christian theological response because there's so much to do there, and also it's slightly more developed than in some of the other religious traditions. but at the same time, it is one that cuts right across different religions and also those who are maybe even humanists. So I was speaking at an event just last week where there was a humanist scholar who said, I agree with much of what you say, from my perspective, this makes sense that we need to actually look at values and what we value and why we value, and think about what that then looks like in philosophical terms. So I think there are opportunities for that, and that's what Laudato Si really intended. It was to address to all people, not just including those of other religious faiths, but also those who maybe didn't have a faith but who were genuinely concerned about how to move forward.
Sure. What about, could you say a little bit more about how you think the church can respond to the ecological issues facing us? And some part of that is, what can I do? What can a regular church member do to make an impact? There's a sort of fatalism that when we think about how little the impact I have can make a difference.
Yes, well, I mean, it also goes down to everybody's conscience as well. And I think it's about reducing the number of goods we consume. That's really what the bottom line is, as well as changing our pattern of energy consumption and looking at, if you like, all the choices that we make in our lifestyles as to whether there can be adjustments. They're never going to be sufficient. We're always going to have more than those who are living in poverty, for example. But we can make changes which do have an impact. And I don't think anyone should belittle what those changes are, but we can also try and press for structural change as well at the larger level and not just the individual level. And I think that's quite important because these global issues are so huge that, we know that just changing, the way I travel or something like that isn't necessarily going to have that much individual impact, but collectively it can. And also some of the ways politicians and others make decisions, we can put pressure on governments. Within our churches as well, we have a project at the moment at the Laudato Si Research Institute that's on decarbonising the Catholic Church, starting in the Salford diocese, but then spreading out. And that is about energy use in buildings and so on, and changing the consumption of energy that we use and transport. So looking at a whole range of areas in relation to going to church in our practice, in our Christian lives. Just on a practical level, it's also possible, of course, to bring in creation more into liturgy. So to weave it in, and bring in that twin area of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, so that there's more awareness. So it's a combination of our responsibility to educate, but also the responsibility to try at least, or make attempts to put into practice changes in the way we function as both as individuals and as communities.
I should point out that many of our participants are expressing gratitude for your effort here, but I'm going to carry on with some questions. One is asked that if you know the work of an Irish Catholic author, Lorna Byrne, on behalf of the environment and climate change. She's currently working on a book combining spiritual truths with scientific findings, and her work and mission have much to contribute to the cause going forward, she thinks. So have you heard that name?
I know there are a number of spiritual writers coming out of the Irish tradition that have contributed to this area. There's somebody I know called Lorna Gold, but maybe that's someone else. But yes, there are, I think the Celtic tradition in particular is actually quite interesting, because the Celtic saints, that is Scotland, Cornwall, Ireland, Wales, they were often very close to nature and the natural world, and they lived out their lives in simplicity. So if we can, just try and simplify, slow down, not, even little decisions like that make a difference. Even not sending emails, which is often virtually impossible for an academic
Yes.
to try and do something like that. But even that uses energy. So I just think that there are things that we can do. It's very difficult to for me to sort of say A needs to do this or that, because everyone has to work it out in their own conscience. I think it has to be a free decision of conscience, rather than under some kind of fear-laden decision. So I think that the fear is obviously there, the fear of the disaster coming, but there's also things that we can do to slow down the process so that more people have time to make the kind of decisions that we need to make in order to avert the worst possible effects. So I think that's what we really need to try and do, is buy time. We're not going to have wholesale global change instantly, but we can at least do our part to slow down the process, so that there are ways of and means of working out what then needs to be put in the interim. Eventually, carbon capture has to happen, of course, as part of the process of minimizing climate change. But there's also ways that we can protect biodiversity and be proactive in that, in ecological restoration projects and others.
One of our participants writes from Canada, and she says, we in Canada, we're in a serious place of working for truth and reconciliation with First Nations and Indigenous peoples. Their understanding of creation and of human relationships with the natural world is in many ways far more in tune with integral ecology than Western perspectives have been. Do you find that there are equivalent ancient wisdoms, quote unquote, to draw on in the UK and in other countries where you are connected or have visited?
Yes, that's a really good point. In fact, we had a scholar here with us called John Berkman, who was talking about the Indigenous from Canada, talking about Indigenous communities there and some of those traditions. So my sense is that we need to listen at a global level. At the local level, there is the Celtic tradition, as I said, which is historical rather than one that's where there are living sort of people. But there are still some farmers and others in Wales and other places that sort of practice a fairly simple lifestyle, other small communities, etc., that live it out. But it's not quite the same as the Native American or other Indigenous Aboriginal communities in Australia, for example. So they can be more emblematic of the kinds of lifestyles that we need to emulate, while at the same time recognizing that even Indigenous communities in some parts of the world aren't perfect either. So I sort of resist a little bit romanticizing. I was talking to a colleague at Radboud University called Frans Wijzen, and he tells me he's studied dozens of different Indigenous communities in Indonesia, and some of them are very good in their practices, eco practices, others less so. So what we really need to know is, why are they like that? Have they been influenced by Western cultures or not, or is it for other reasons? But at the same time, I think there's a lot to learn, and that's why we are trying to, as far as possible, bring those from the Indigenous communities from the global South round to the table, so that their voices can be heard, and we can learn from each other. So that alternative way of knowing, I think, is very much in tune with Laudato Si, that integral approach. So thank you for raising that point.
Celia, could you maybe talk about how generationally people have received this message, maybe through Laudato Si, or even generally the climate change message? Is there a greater response, presumably from the younger generation, but on the Laudato Si side, it might be different than it is on just the pure secular approach to addressing climate change and the climate crisis?
Yeah, in the Catholic Church, there's the Global Catholic Climate Movement that changed its name to the Laudato Si movement, and that has affiliates, young people affiliated to it all over the world. So, and I think that, I think that that adding a theological element sort of enhances one's sense of energy and responsibility. But if you go to sort of meetings on sustainability or some of these areas, what I've noticed is that it's extremely cross-generational. So it's not just young people, it's actually many people, whatever their age, are interested in this and recognize its importance because they're concerned perhaps for their grandchildren as well, or their children even. So I think that it's not only is it multi-faith, it's also cross-generational, this question. And it's something that we all have to, or will need to try and address in the way we live. So it's also in if you look at some other churches, the Anglican Church, for example, it's an area that they've named as vitally important for their mission. So people interested in the mission of the church don't avoid this issue either, because they see it as all wrapped up as part of what it means to consider some of these questions. So I think it's really for the whole person, but it's also for the whole community. And so I don't think there is necessarily, sometimes people think that it's just young people who are concerned with this, but that's not been my experience in talking to different groups about these questions.
Excellent, thank you. This will have to be our last question, and I apologize to those whose questions we're not able to get to at this time, but an off-cited point in Laudato Si is highlighting our existing throwaway culture. And this obviously has ramifications beyond misplaced rubbish or poor recycling habits, but in our global economy and other areas of social engagement. How might this come to bear for all of us with particular regard to biodiversity? And a related question, does the church have a role in changing Western society's free market economies, which encourage this sort of unbridled consumerism? And if so, how? That's a lot.
I'll just touch on some of those.
Yeah.
I think the issue of the global economies is a really important one. And I actually know some scholars who are actually currently at Georgetown University and others who are working out what a different kind of economic model might look like if it was more of an integral economy that took into account biodiversity, rather than just being a functional market good, if you like, was understood in a completely different kind of way. And I think that's really what we need to press for. We need to press for economists to really get their act together and think differently and outside their box, and then be able to persuade people that this is maybe a genuine alternative. Because at the moment, the default position is the global market economy, and that hasn't proved effective or sufficient to solve some of these really important problems. And then the other one about consumerism and biodiversity, just the use of plastic, for example, the amount of plastic that goes into our oceans is astronomical, and they're the ones that, that's how many species are killed in the seas and so on. So there are little sort of changes about single plastic use. I have noticed that has started to escalate in terms of being popular not to use plastic, or some of those other plastic bottles and so on. So how do we use those kinds of things or not? And if we still do, maybe we need to think about changing that. So I don't think recycling is enough. I think we have to look more radically about our paradigm. In other words, what is it that's really orientating ourselves? Just as the sort of final point, I should say that Pope Francis never criticizes science or those who are working in technology as if they are demeaned in any way. When he criticizes the technological paradigm, it's more the worldview that shapes our thinking. So he welcomes, and I welcome, science and the creativity in scientists. I think it's absolutely vital, but it has to be understood in terms of its limits, rather than understood as the answer to the only aspect that we need to consider in answering these problems. So it's one of the ingredients, but we have to be discerning about which to use when, rather than assuming that a technological solution is the only way forward. Because as we found out, people may know the facts, they may know what the solution is, but unless they're motivated to change or change their way of thinking, then nothing much is going to shift. So I think, it's this holistic, integral kind of approach that we need to try and emulate in our communities and our individual lives.
Thank you, Celia. Thanks so much. If we weren't already awakened to the challenge, we are now, and I'm grateful for your penetrating comments. I should have said at the outset that I'm Father Jim Least, and I serve as the Director for Academic Initiatives and Outreach for the Notre Dame London Global Gateway. And at this time, I want to thank those who make this possible for us and have engaged many of you in their shout outs. Again, our sponsors, the Office of Notre Dame International, the Office of Sustainability at Notre Dame, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, ThinkND, and Durham University's Center for Catholic Studies. I also want to thank our London Global Gateway Comms and Events team and those who are behind the scenes making this all happen so seamlessly. And I finally want to thank all of you who have participated today, your thought-provoking questions, your time with us. We're grateful. Please keep an eye out for 2 other lectures in this series. One will be in February, March, and the other will be in April, May. So we'll keep you posted. Be sure to sign up for our email list, and we'll send shout outs to you as they become available. Thank you all, and have a good evening, good night, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you.